Amandine, it's nice to see you. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
I really appreciate your time, especially. And you're here to talk about AI in games. So, for those of you who don't know, Amandine is the CEO and co founder of Wild Meta, who are a company who specialise in advancing game AI, which is artificial intelligence, that kind of powers games and the way that enemies behave, or anything behaves, I guess, in games. Using machine learning, which is kind of a hot topic, I guess, at the minute in the world of computing and technology. So to get us started, I mean, for those of you who maybe at home aren't as familiar with AI in games, I was wondering, could you give us an introduction, Amandine? Like, what's the history of AI in games? What's this all about?
Okay, so good. An introduction of game AI. So that's interesting because you mentioned game AI and explaining that when we talk about game AI, it's what's behind characters' behavior, right? But then you mentioned artificial intelligence, and that's where it can be confusing because what my company is doing is using machine learning, and usually we talk about AI. So to remove any confusion, the way we're doing game AI hasn't changed in years in video games. So you're going to use different techniques, things like, for example, nav mesh or pathfinding, object avoidance, these kind of things specifically. And so the bots are going to be hard coded. And so this is how it has been done for years. And I think I'm not necessarily the best person to give you a timeline for this type of traditional game AI, because what we're doing is we are changing completely the way you're doing AI. And so we're using machine learning. So instead of following a script of actions or having really complex codes together, we are actually using machine learning to have NPCs that actually learn to play a specific game, and so they play with the players live. So that means that when they decide to emit an action to maybe attack or be more on the defensive or whatever, if for example, if you're using for the opponent AI, then it's going to adapt and to play the game depending on what is around and the actions of the players. And so just to give a bit of an explanation of machine learning in games, maybe, to give you a bit of timeline on that, machine learning has been using video games for quite some time to show their work, because games are a very good environment for machine learning. It's a controlled environment, and so it's great when you're doing machine learning research to test your assumptions and just to train also. And so we've seen lots of application for researchers, but then we've seen kind of a gap between this academic research and the settings and the needs they have, and then the real life application within the game. And so we see more and more companies, especially AAA big studios, that are dedicating some teams to see the different application of machine learning in games. And the thing is, there isn't just one way of using machine learning. My company is focusing on the game AIs. But then you can also use machine learning, for example, for animations, to improve the animation, or for different aspects, let's say for balancing the difficulty of the game, or there are many ways, but we're focusing on the game AI.
Yeah, that sounds really interesting. And I want to focus on the word you used there, because you used the word adapt. And I guess that's the key word, isn't it? Because historically, AI would have just been whatever a programmer thinks of. If a programmer thinks to write a response to something that the player does, then the enemy or the environment or the object could do it. But the exciting thing about machine learning is that you kind of just give it the same tool set that a player would have and say, experiment with it and figure out what works by iterating on it and trying it multiple times to figure out what the best way to, I guess, be more human is, like to act more like a person.
Yes, and there are also different way of different techniques with machine learning. And so, for example, there is something that you can do to help the AI be a bit more human-like, and it's using existing gameplay played by humans. You show that to the AI while it's training, and so it can learn some mechanisms and tactics. It can be especially interesting if, for example, you want to show some cooperative behavior. And so the AI can understand that, okay, I can do that. So then by playing the game again and again and again, it learns different things, but it can also learn from what it has seen before.
Okay, that's really cool. So you talked about how the machine learning has been, like we said at the top of the show, it's a kind of a hot topic in the world of technology generally, and there's been a lot of kind of theoretical implementations or discussions or experiments, I guess. How close do you think we are to seeing machine learning, appearing in AAA titles? Are we like on the brink of this happening really soon, do you think?
I think it's already happening. It's just we don't necessarily know about it. So there have been a few companies talking about it, but sometimes you really have to be looking for this information to really know about this specific game using machine learning. So for example, the other day I was giving a presentation, and the moderator in the end asked me for some example of games, and I was like, okay, so I know this game is using this. For example, Sony and I think it was Insomniac, when building the Spider-Man, the latest Spider-Man, they did some really quiet press releases about using machine learning for the animation to make it more like movie-like. Okay. And so I was mentioning this, and the moderator was also saying, oh yeah, I also know that in this game and that game. And so without really looking specifically on the internet, you don't necessarily come across it, but yes, it's already in use. Mm-hmm. But now I think what's going to come soon is that it's not going to be just reserved for the big companies who have the resources to allocate an entire team for that and to have their own system in place. But I want to see more studios using this technology. And the thing is, I understand it's hard to integrate right now because, well, in terms of the technological aspect, it's hard to find talents who understand games and machine learning. That's already two kind of rare profiles. So the two combined, it's very hard to find. And also you need to understand your need for compute power. You need to understand the tech stack. You need to also figure out how this is going to fit into your existing team. And also in terms of monetary aspect, that's quite important for most studios. Most studios have budget for one project or one game. The thing is, machine learning is expensive when you have to build everything from scratch, and if you have to have a budget for the R&D to start from scratch, it may not be. It may be hard to justify just for one game. And that's why we decided, my co-founder and I, we really looked at this, and that's why we tried to build a solution that works for as many games as possible and can be really adaptable. And so we can do the R&D so studios don't need to do it, because I don't see studios having machine learning experts in-house soon. Mm-hmm. But that doesn't mean that you can't use services and companies that are using machine learning within their own system, that already have developed something specifically for one use case, and you can use that. And I think that will be the best way to for machine learning to be integrated today in video games. But then it's also a chicken and egg problem. You have the PR part, but also you don't want to be the first one to integrate a new technology, and so you want to see more examples of this being used specifically. And so you're like, well, you need to have a first one. Like, you need to have a big name or someone that has some visibility to show the way and to democratize this. Also, that will help a lot.
Yeah, I guess it maybe seems a bit risky, especially if it is, as you say, it can be expensive. And obviously I think it's quite clear to see what the benefits for players could be. Like, I think everybody who plays games would love to see AI move forward and to play against enemies or interactive environments that feel more real, that feel more kind of comprehensively thought out. But it sounds like, from what you guys are doing, there's actually as much benefit for companies themselves, like in terms of like smoothing out processes, making processes easier. And you mentioned animation, and I know you guys do, or you've talked about doing stuff with QA as well, and how you might be able to kind of streamline the QA process using machine learning. Is that something you could talk about?
Yeah, sure. It's not necessarily our focus, but when we were thinking about the different use cases, you think first about the usual type of game. So you think, okay, what the benefits for a multiplayer game? So you're like, well, you can have opponents that are always available. You can also have if you have lots of players in a game and you have some players that for some reason are dropping and get disconnected, you replace them with bots. If you have a competitive game, you need to have like stronger bots that can really be good opponent for the players to improve. We also talk already about the navigation, how you go from point A to point B naturally and just navigating your map. And so also if you're using procedural generation, which happen more and more now in games, how do you create an AI that is robust to that? Well, with machine learning, it's much easier. But then also you mentioned Q&A and QA. And for QA, we've been thinking, okay, even if it's not our core focus, once you have an AI that knows how to play a game, then we can imagine using it to explore its environment and report something that it notices, some bugs. Or you can also imagine having AIs that test your servers, for example, instead of paying for having people from all over the world connecting and having to organize all that. You can also start by having just bot that test your servers. That's kind of more like extra, like a bonus thing, because the efforts to adapt machine learning, like to create the model for one game and to have an AI that knows to play one game, it may be a lot of work if it's just for testing or for QA when you already have different things in place that can work right now. But then if you already are working with the studios on the AI for the multiplayer game, then well, you can use almost the same AI, but just for a different purpose. So it's more about repurposing something that you've already developed.
Yeah, I mean, if you can train an AI to play the game, you could train the AI to try and break the game. And it sounds
exactly,
like it could be
yes.
a good way to talk about it. I'm really interested in what you were saying there about how the scale of games has increased. You go back in time to the games of 20 years ago, they were a lot more contained. They were still difficult to make, but there was a sense of scope that was like, okay, well, these are the walls of the world we've created, and you can see where they are, and you can test everything within those four walls. Now, with an increasing amount of games that either rely on procedural generation, like you say, and we've seen games like that, things like No Man's Sky, or you look at games like Red Dead Redemption 2, which are just huge. Like the world they take place in is so big. It's like, how could you possibly code AI for that in the old way as these games get bigger and bigger and bigger? And that's a trend that's only increasing. Like, players are more demanding about big game worlds than they've ever been before. They want worlds that are massive and also immersive. And you think machine learning could really help bridge that gap?
Definitely, yes. And that's why it's important right now to start adopting this technology, because we reached the limit of what we can do. And that's funny because you mentioned that players have high expectations. Actually, I think they have just been let down by so many game AIs. It takes lots of effort today to create a believable character with traditional game AI. And so it's a lot of work to make it human-like. And so with machine learning, you can do that in a way much easier way. But, if you ask people about good game AI, they're just going to mention games that are from 10 years ago. That's because the technology hasn't evolved during this time. And so I don't really think that necessarily players have more expectations. They're just tired of being let down by the game AI. If they can give you something, if you talk to lots of players, something that's going to come up again and again when talking about game AIs is the number of games that were completely ruined just because there were a dumb bot somewhere, and that just break the engagement. That doesn't necessarily mean that because of a bot they lost the game or something. Just it was obvious it was a bot, and so you're like, maybe I feel a bit insulted by the game, or you feel that you're not into the game anymore.
Yeah.
And there are many games that are using bots, and it's just, if they were more human-like, if they were smarter, I really dream of a moment where you, as a player, you play a game and you don't care if it's another human or if it's a bot. Like, you don't see the difference. You can't tell. And I can't wait to reach this point, because right now it's not the case. But it's not just because in terms of technically it's hard to do.
Yeah.
It's because it requires a huge amount of effort. Any very good game AI has required a huge amount of effort. And if you look at, for example, a game that is a big multiplayer game, then it's not necessarily your priority. And so you don't necessarily allocate the right resources for that. So that could be tricky too. It's not just that we reach the limit of the technology, it's also, do you have the resources internally to put the efforts to make your game AI believable characters?
Yeah. It takes a lot of investment, doesn't it?
It does, and studios, we understand the complexity of studios' budgets, and so you have to make choices, you have to manage priorities. So yeah, and it's just sad that the players are paying the price of that. So that's what we want to change, but I'm sure it's coming. I mean, I see more and more people very interested in talking about this and how to just level up the game AI. So it's coming for sure.
Yeah, I think it's a future we can all look forward to. And I really want to thank you for joining the show, because it's a really interesting topic. I could talk to you about it all day, but I can't because I've got the rest of the show to do. Thank you for joining me, Amandine. I really appreciate it.
Thanks a lot.